What's your take on trade?
Yeah. Well, it's a big shift, but
I know that was a abrupt shift. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
In my mind, it like made all the sense, all those things, because energy and this global version of policy, right?
Yeah.
Which it's like this catch-all. I think trade ends up looping into this.
Yeah.
And because typically economic ties keep us from getting into wars. Mm-hmm. And I actually believe that. I think building economic ties within countries allows for diplomacy to happen and not shooting each other, right? As soon as that economic and diplomacy things fail, that's when we start fighting. And that's when we start blowing each other up. Yeah. And we're seeing this groundswell of wars that are continuing to pop up. And so I can't help but think that they're kind of linked together. Yeah. So that's where it was in my head.
Well, I know I can definitely connect the dots, and I'm going to connect another dot too. I think that part of the reason why we've got so many global conflicts right now is America is not demonstrating strong leadership. And if we were, you'd see less of these foreign dictators and enemies being willing to stand up and do some of the things they're doing. But they view the White House as weak, and because of that, they're doing these aggressive actions across the globe, and we're paying the price for it. But in terms of trade, in general, I'm a free trade. I believe in free trade. But here's the problem. We talk about enemies. We were just talking about them. And they use trade as a weapon against the United States to weaken us, and we can't let that to happen. And so there are things that are in the best interest of our national security, whether it's energy, whether it's our food security, whether it's some of these industries where our enemies know that if they weaken an industry in the United States, they weaken us as a country. And so they use trade as a weapon. We can't let that happen. We saw President Trump, when he was president, realize that was happening, and he stood up to some of our enemies around trade issues, and we're better off because of it. So it's a fine line. We can't use trade and trade policies to protect and just create special interests for certain industries to enrich them. I'm not a fan of that.
Okay.
But we have to make sure we're not playing into the playbook of our enemies in so many different ways.
Do you think that's a second order consequence though? No, like I can imagine there's some ways to keep that from happening, but most people are driven by self-interest. Yeah. I think everybody's driven by self-interest. I think anybody who's denying that is denying human nature at some capacity. And so, thinking about one industry versus another, it gets really difficult, especially when you're talking about so many economic sectors, right? Whether, we're trading specifically, computer chips, or we're talking about natural gas, right? Like thinking of all these different industries where trade has to exist. I'm definitely for open trade, like an open market of trade. Free trade to me sounds like a really great platitude. It sounds really good. Sure. But is that really supply and demand limits freedom, right? Just in its own right? And so how do we encourage some countries are going to be really great at producing something, and other countries are going to be better at producing other things, right? And so it's a really complex system in general. So I guess that self-interest piece of it seems really, it's like a big battle.
Super hard.
Yeah, it's super hard. And I think we're probably only the second or third probably the second generation that world trade even really exists at the capacity that it does now, right? Yeah. There's a book Thomas Friedman wrote. It's called The World is Flat, and how basically the internet and trade open the door for real free trade across the globe, right? This ability that, Madagascar can trade with any country in the world, right? And they have all the tools to be able to do that, where just a generation ago, they didn't have that tool. Like 1980, they couldn't do that necessarily. So we're kind of dealing with a set of cards that we're learning as we go, right?
I think that's true. There's another book I read earlier this year, actually last year, that it's got a scary title, but it talks about this issue, and it's a book called "The End of the World is Just Beginning."
Interesting. Okay.
And it talks about trade.
Yeah.
And two things that stood out to me in this book, and I think it's completely accurate. One is that the reason the world economy has been able to be so successful over the last 50 years is for one reason, and it's the United States has kept the world a safe place and kept our seas free. so that goods can be transported around the world.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. We have lost our way as a country, and our Navy is not what it used to be. And we see our global foes like China who are standing up a Navy, and they're putting a lot more resources into it than we are. And if we don't make sure we mind this carefully and take care of this, our ability to see free trade or trade, let's not call it free trade, but trade around the world through the seas is really in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And here's the challenge with that. When you think about food security, when you think about energy security, there are so many countries. I mean, we're going to probably be okay here, right?
Yeah.
We're a big country. We've got a lot of natural resources. We do produce a lot of food. We need to be more careful about that. But there's a lot of countries that don't have the ability to produce any food, or hardly any energy. And if the world economy gets put on its knees because you can't trade across the seas, and we have problems that are a direct cause of the U.S. not being strong like it used to be, it's going to hurt our country, but it hurts others.
Yeah.
And the other part of the book is about demographics and the fact that we don't have as many kids as we used to. And, we have to be careful about that too, because one of the key things about the economy and quality of life is having a stable population, or a population that's growing.
Yeah.
And it's another reason why we want legal immigration in this country, so that our economy can continue to grow. But
that's our ace in the hole. For me, that's our as a country, as the United States goes, which is not true of most other nations. There's some nations that really could call themselves a melting pot. There's a few, but there's not really that many.
One of the few.
We're one of the few, and so that legal migration to this country is important. It's going to be a driving. It's going to be a driving leader in how we, spend the rest before the world fully ends.
And we need to,
as long as we don't nuke each other.
That's right. But China, they're going to see their population decline over the next 3 to 4 decades because of population growth and the fertility rate. We don't have that problem as much here in the United States, but it's something we need to be thoughtful of.
Yeah, and it's something that could change. They have a neighbor that has lots of kids in India. And so, they could change those relationships in India, and they can allow migration in to help support. I know I've seen the arguments on both sides of the geography of China and how, it could not sustain itself. Peter Zion talks a lot about that and demographics. And at the end of the day, we need to worry less about what all these other countries are doing and focus on how do we right our ship? Where are the challenges that we're, systematically failing on.
Correct.
And we got a lot of things. I think there's a lot of things. Military, we spend a lot of money. I don't know how we can spend so much money and still not be as effective or as much of a deterrence as we should when we're spending the amount of money that we spend on Department of Defense.
We do, but the sad part about that
there's a lot of waste in there.
I'm sure, yes, for sure, but we're spending more on interest on the national debt than we are defending our country now, which
I know.
Crazy, right?
That's crazy.
Our spending habits in Washington have created an environment where our interest payment to other countries is more than we're spending on defending ourselves from those other countries. Think about that.
I know, man. It's crazy. And you're a finance guy, so I can't help my head. I lose an understanding of it. There's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have, but I have not read it.
You should please read it. Please read it. I'm begging you to read it because I want somebody to tell me that Griffin doesn't know what he's talking about, because it for sure sounds like he knows what he's talking about, and he has so much history on the Fed and the creation of money and what printing money actually is versus adding zeros to a ledger, because you have a fiat currency versus an actual physical currency. Like, I can't help but think we're going down an uncharted territory with money, and how that $34 trillion in debt, like, how does that compound over time? And then how do we even get that under control? I just don't even, it's hard for me to even see a route out of that, aside from massive tax increases.
Yeah. Massive tax increases, mass inflation, or, meltdown of the American economy. But I'm an optimist. I think you have to be in business, to be in politics.
For sure.
But until
I like that you're an optimist.
Yeah.
I need more optimists in my life.
Well, I'm a realist too, though, and there's a lot of hard work ahead of us. And I do think that the next 6-ish years until the end of this decade are going to make we will make a decision about the future of this country. We're at a precipice right now, and we're going to get past a point of no return soon. And we've got to get some people in Washington that are willing to elevate these issues and start to bring some people along.